I'm so sorry. Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to JSJC TV. Sustainability means meeting our own needs without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs. Adopting sustainable practices in our day to day lives can have significant impacts in the long run. However, the idea of sustainable development varies from country to country depending on various factors. India, for instance, is quite a different country from other countries such as the USA and Japan in terms of ecology, geographical and topographical conditions, economy, culture, diversity, etc. Therefore, the research conducted and the plans that are developed that are formulated for these developed countries may or may not work for India. Arguably, one of the central points of discussion in the international development circles is that our policies and examples that are adopted by the countries known by the global north, the countries that are regarded as developed by the current development indices, over influencing international sustainable development policies. I am Khushi Aggarwal, and to discuss this issue and more, we have with us today Ms. Ananya Mishra, who is a program assistant at the Institute for Sustainable Communities India. Thank you for being here today, Ms. Ananya.
Thanks for having me, Kushi.
Uh, Also, we have Professor Ricky Levy. She is an assistant professor at the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability. Welcome to the discussion, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
So, let me start by asking you, Professor Ricky, that your research focuses on both Indian and Western environmental ethics. So, do you think that the global north, drives ideas around sustainable development at all, or is this just a fanciful idea that some global south activists came up with?
Okay, so I think first of all, before we're going to speak, because it's very hard to speak on one Western idea, okay, of sustainability. And I think the best thing is to start and think of what happened in the 60s and the 70s of the previous century when there was a wide recognition that there is something which is called climate change. So there was a lot of different theories that were emerged, and each one of them tried to, to offer explanation why we have this environmental crisis and how can we solve it. However, we can still recognize in the evolution of Western environmentalism two major approaches. Okay, and one that pretty much one is an opposite to each other. So the first one is referred, or we can call it as shallow ecology or technological optimism, that basically argues that we have invented a very sophisticated science. We have such a progressive technologies. Every environmental problem that we have or that we will face, we can basically solve it with these tools, with these solutions, with technical and technological solutions. The other approach, which I think the best school that describes the major ideas, is the school of deep ecology, basically argued that this crisis that we are facing today, which is that the most basic degradation of our basic element, like the quality of the air that we breathe or the water that we drink or our food production system, is a reflection to a much deeper crisis. It's an ethical crisis, it's a cultural crisis, it's a crisis of perception, and more precisely, a crisis of the Western perception that have emerged within the dominant financial and system with capitalism and with the starting from the Industrial Revolution. So they basically argued that the way that the Western anthropocentric perspective, meaning that the way that human and nature are organized in starting from the Industrial Revolution, basically gave nature, separated human from nature and gave nature instrumental value, meaning viewing it mainly as resource. So they viewed this is the source, according to deep ecologists. Okay, so they said what we need to do, and I think that in this respect, Indian tradition played a major role and influence by offering non-anthropocentric perception, whether it is in the Indian philosophies or certain Indian philosophies or certain religious practices, for example, that we could see the reverence for nature, for different natural element, for example. So that was one source. But they said what we need the most is not just to have a non-anthropocentric perception. We need to reorganize our economic system. So these are the two major approaches. Now, I think that if we will view global environmentalism, the dominant approach that rules, I think, almost everywhere in the world is the shallow ecology, unfortunately. And I think that in India it's very interesting because we can see a collision between these two approaches. Because on the one hand, the government and governmental policies pretty much represent shallow ecology, which was borrowed from the West. However, if you observe the traditional ecological knowledge that was brought mainly through activists in the Indian environmental movement, starting from the Chipko through Miti Bachao Andolan, or through the work of Vandana Shiva, for example, in agroecology, or Anupam Mishra in the reviving of the traditional water harvesting system, then we can see a manifestation of the major ideas that the deep ecologies, the Western deep ecologies, really argue that these are the approaches that we need to embrace. Now, we need to embrace not only in India. Now, the interesting thing that in India, in the rural area, or in the way that natural resources are being managed, we can find this knowledge. Okay, and that is the knowledge that I think that India can export to the world. For example. And unfortunately, in many cases, India embraced many technological, very centralized technological solution that undermined the indigenous Indian knowledge. Okay.
Right. That's a very interesting point, actually, Professor Ricky. Ms. Ananya, my question to you is, what role do you think, factors such as socio-cultural practices or even economic practices play in the formulation of sustainable urban development plans that are adopted in India?
Thanks for the question, Khushi. I agree with Dr. Ricky on a few fronts there. Because, I mean, if you just look at the Indian way of life, or if you were to just compare, I mean, if it's a very simplistic comparison to draw, quite rightly pointed out by Dr. Ricky, but if you were to just compare, say, the West with the East, or say even India, if we're just talking about our country, there has been a lot of difference in the way we've gone about approaching issues, sustainability issues, climate issues, or resource issues. And while a lot of things have, we have seen a lot of advancements that have come across to us from the West, a lot of documentation that has happened. But I think that's where the primary difference lies, because it's part of the culture, and as you mentioned, the whole socio-cultural aspects to the Indian way of living, the closeness with nature, and the way sustainability is generally part of our lives at an individual level. It has been happening. I mean, such practices have been happening, but I think the great tragedy is that not a lot of it has been systematically been happening. Not at a systems level, or say not even at a level where it can be documented and then passed on and shared. So definitely a lot of difference there. And when you look at practices, I think it's so important, just looking at the whole concept of sustainability and how climate change needs to be dealt with, particularly in the urban context. There's so much opportunity for cross learning, across borders. It's something that's worked really well in, say, a European country. Could be a good solution to, say, a similar problem that's being faced in a different part of the world. But what needs to be kept in mind is that a simple pick up and pick it up and then just simply replicate it along the same lines, that's something that's not ever really worked out successfully, because any model that's been picked up has been successful in a particular context, given all the socio-cultural factors that exist, given the economics of it, given the demographic attitude towards it, even behavior, individual behavior to a concept that plays a major role in it being a successful model or a failure. And similar things have played out, when in cases where the same solution has been picked and tried to be implemented in a different context, but without a lot of modification to cater for socio-cultural practices, it has generally not resulted in the same benefits that it resulted in initially, say in a different region. I think the biggest example of this is the whole biofuels policy that India was moving towards just a few years back. How it's a great concept. It is at a concept level, at an experiment level, it has also been successful, but in a different part of the world. And simply replicating it here is not the best way to go about it, because we saw how it came about. There were a lot of issues, infrastructural issues, the whole the ecological aspect of it, not considering the kind of biodiversity that exists on ground. And more so, to come up with a very recent example, if you just look at the whole electric vehicle push. So one of the biggest problems that we're trying to tackle at an urban sustainability level is the traffic congestions, the vehicular emissions, air pollution. So electric vehicles is one of the biggest solutions being touted as something that will solve all of this, but also not take away the mobility options that individuals have. But if you look at the way it's being simultaneously sort of carried out within, say, let's take, for example, the US and India, you have Tesla, that's a very big electric vehicle player there. And Tesla is known for its four-wheelers, which are, so it's introduced the concept of electric vehicles within the four-wheeler space. But say in India, if you just look at the more recent news, you see Ola coming across as one of the bigger players, one of the first it has the first movers advantage in the two-wheeler space. So they have decided to come out with a two-wheeler that will be based on the EV concept. So you see the difference here. In America, maybe a four-wheeler works really well. In India, they try to do the same. We had different companies, major automobile brands coming in with electric versions of their cars, but that whole market is still to find a good ground with the consumers, simply because I think the biggest factor here is because just look at our roads. See how many cars versus how many two-wheelers do you see. There is definitely a more cultural or more individual affinity towards having a two-wheeler, again because we have a lot of structural issues here, and roads are narrow, we tend to have more traffic, condition of roads is bad, the per capita income is lower, so not everybody can afford a car. People tend to go for two wheelers. It's easy, quick mobility. It also gives you the status of having owned a vehicle. So launching EV within the two wheeler space then makes more sense, because here you've taken into account so many factors that are so contextual to India, that are so Indian. You have to get into the minds of the people if you really want your solution to succeed. So again, it's all about keeping it within. Keeping it contextually relevant.
Right. Those are some really interesting points made. So I think the entire point of the discussion, the conclusion came to that, is that, that we simply cannot adopt Western practices and Western ideas of sustainable development just because they work there. Because there are a lot of things in India in terms of ecology that needs to be kept in mind, and the lifestyle of people that needs to be kept in mind before, adopting those practices. And they need to, and people in India need to focus more on the indigenous practices themselves. So I think that's it. I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for today. I would like to thank our panelists for being here. This has indeed been a very insightful discussion. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot, Khushi. Thank you, Dr. Ricky. Wonderful having
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank our viewers for joining us today. We hope you had a good time. Stay tuned on JSJC TV for more such insightful discussions, and do subscribe to our channel. Thank you.